Bun găsit la emisiunea Știință și Cunoaștere. Oare suntem în punctul unei iluminări a conștiinței? Oare omenirea se îndreaptă acum spre un nou iluminism al științei? Pare de necrezut, dar conform opiniei unui profesor de la Universitatea Harvard, acest lucru se întâmplă deja de câțiva ani, iar noi suntem martori acestor evenimente. Deși nu o putem numi evoluție spirituală, cum ar putea crede unii, totuși, omenirea se îndreaptă spre un nou salt calitativ oferit de mijloacele științei și tehnologiei. Bruce Lipton și alții au promovat de mult posibilitatea unui salt calitativ al întregii omeniri, dar nu am reușit să pătrund esența logică și rațională al acestui fenomen până ce nu l-am cunoscut pe Dr. Steven Pinker, absolvent al Colegiului Dawson și a facultății Weigar, devenind apoi profesor la universitățile Harvard și McGill. Am ajuns la Steven Pinker cu ajutorul prietenului meu Marius Burcea de la București, psiholog de profesie care are o mare admirație pentru munca și cercetările științifice ale profesorului Pinker. Desigur, vă puteți imagina faptul că o personalitate de nivel mondial primește mii de mesaje săptămânale de la pacienți, terapeuți și jurnaliști care îl invită pe cele mai importante posturi de televiziune din lume. Șansele ca să primesc un răspuns la cererea mea erau minime. Cu toate acestea, după o așteptare de câteva luni, am avut acea oportunitate care mi-a adus mari speranțe în reușita interviului, iar acesta s-a concretizat 6 luni mai târziu, fiind planificat conform orarului extrem de plin al profesorului Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker este profesor de psihologie și director al Centrului de Neuroștiințe Cognitive din cadrul prestigiosului Institut de Tehnologie din Massachusetts. A devenit cunoscut în spațiul cultural occidental datorită bestsellerului The Language Instinct, Instinctul limbajului. Cartea sa numită Cum funcționează mintea a primit nenumărate distincții literare și științifice, dintre care amintim premiul de carte al ziarului Los Angeles Times, distincția New York Times pentru cartea anului și nominalizare pentru premiul Pulitzer categoria non-ficțiune. Steven Pinker este unul dintre liderii cercetărilor din științele contemporane ale cogniției, iar cărțile sale oferă o viziune sistematică și sinoptică asupra minții omenești, pornind de la o viziune ce îmbină biologia evoluționistă și teoriile computaționale dezvoltate în ultimele decenii de către cercetătorii din științele informației și ale inteligenței artificiale. Noua carte a lui Steven Pinker, numită Iluminismul acum, cazul pentru rațiune, umanism, știință și progres, care face obiectul acestei emisiuni, este o argumentație foarte lungă pentru o idee destul de simplă și care mai și este, după opinia autorului, absolut verificabilă. Idealurile formulate de iluminism se realizează chiar dacă lent și sinuos, iar cifrele o pot dovedi în mod obiectiv. Există motive structurale și contingente pentru care acest lucru nu este evident pentru oamenii prea puțin informați sau chiar dezinformați, dar, pe cât de incredibil ar putea să pară, dacă lăsăm statistica să vorbească dincolo de iluziile noastre cognitive și predispozițiile noastre înșelătoare sau alte neliniști metafizice iluzorii, ne putem convinge singuri de optimismul inerent al acestei cărți. Omenirea progresează. Mai mult, deși aproape nimeni nu știe asta, șocant, nu-i așa, omenirea a făcut progrese în privința tuturor aspectelor pe care, în general, oamenii le consideră esențiale. Acest progres poate fi măsurat. Cei mai mulți oameni sunt de acord că viața este mai bună ca moartea. Sănătatea este mai bună decât boala, prosperitatea este mai bună decât foamea, abundența este mai bună decât sărăcia, pacea este mai bună decât războiul, siguranța este mai bună decât pericolul, libertatea este mai bună decât tirania. Iată, drepturile egale sunt mai bune decât bigotismul și discriminarea, cunoașterea este mai bună decât ignoranța, fericirea este mai bună decât nefericirea, inteligența este mai bună decât prostia. Oportunitatea de a ne bucura de familii, prieteni, cultură și natură sunt mai bune decât munca neinteresantă și monotonia. Dar, în mod absolut incredibil, toate aceste lucruri pe care le-am enumerat pot fi măsurate. Dacă au crescut de-a lungul timpului, atunci avem de-a face cu progres. Ei bine, ceea ce veți afla în acest interviu este faptul că lucrurile stau într-adevăr așa. Rând pe rând, cu minuțiozitate și răbdare, Steven Pinker ne așează dinainte indicatori diversi, grafice și cifre care să arate irefutabil că progresul chiar are loc. Desigur, la baza parcursului ascendent și uneori sinuos, există un proces de creștere intrinsecă a gradului de raționalitate a speciei. Rațiunea este motorul progresului. Cea mai importantă este rațiunea. Rațiunea nu este negociabilă. Dacă există ceva ce au avut în comun gânditorii iluminismului, a fost insistența ca noi să aplicăm cu hotărâre standardele raționalității la înțelegerea lumii și să nu cedăm iarăși unor instanțe generatoare de iluzii, precum credința oarbă, dogmatismul, revelația ezoterică, autoritarismul, carisma, misticismul, divinația, viziunile, intuițiile nesusținute la verificare sau hermeneutica a textelor sacre. De aceea rugămintea mea este să vizionați acest interviu cu multă îngăduință, deschidere și neutralitate. Dear Professor Steven Pinker, welcome to our Science and Knowledge TV program on TVR Cluj, Romania for the first time.
Thank you.
We are going to discuss very important information never presented on Romanian television, and these are related to your latest book, and I welcome you again for accepting the participation to our program and a very long interview.
Thank you.
Your recent book is entitled Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress. Please describe this title.
The Enlightenment refers to the period in the late 18th century in which a number of thinkers such as David Hume, Adam Smith, Voltaire, the French philosophers like Diderot and Condorcet, the American founders such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Paine, all proposed that we should analyze our lives using reason. We should not accept authority or tradition or dogma or scripture, but use our intelligence to understand our condition. They also were big fans of science, which is just the application of reason to understand the physical world. They were also humanists. The word did not exist in their time, but humanism is the moral philosophy that the highest priority is the well-being of humans, and also other animals, not just humans, but conscious, sentient creatures. Now, you might ask, aren't we all humanists? Is there who could be against humanism? Well, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate moral good is the glory of the nation, or the superiority of the race, or imposing religious laws on all of humanity. The final idea that I associate with the Enlightenment is progress. That if we apply reason and science with the goal of making humans better off, we can gradually succeed. Now, the reason I wrote the book is that 250 years ago, one could have thought, well, it'll never work. You can't change human nature. People will always fight. There will always be disease. God dictated that our lives will be filled with suffering and disease and famine and war. And it is romantic or utopian to dream that we can be better off. I wrote the book because now, 250 years later, we have data. And by many measures, the world has improved. And the book contains 75 graphs showing that in measure after measure, life has gotten better over the last 250 years. And I argue that this is because the world, to varying degrees, has adopted the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely to use reason and science to make people better off.
Please make a comment upon those two mottos of your book, and I quote, "Those who are governed by reason desire nothing for themselves which they do not also desire for the rest of humankind." And the other one, "Everything that is not forbidden by laws of nature is achievable given the right knowledge."
The first quote comes from Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch Jewish philosopher of the 17th century. lived in Amsterdam and Leiden. Spinoza, some people argue, is the founder of the Enlightenment. My wife, Rebecca Goldstein, who wrote a book about Spinoza, Betraying Spinoza, calls him the renegade Jew who gave us modernity. Now, it's arbitrary when the Enlightenment begins. Most books say 18th century, Spinoza lived in the 17th century, but still, ideas have to come from somewhere. And certainly, Spinoza's ideas on the role of reason and of morality in many ways helped to launch the Enlightenment. So that quote from Spinoza, "Those who are governed by reason desire nothing for themselves which they do not also desire for all of humanity," is, I think, a profound statement. That is, that there can be, the reason that we have morality is not because God gave us 10 commandments, because God could have given us a different set of 10 commandments. And why did he say you must not covet your neighbor's cattle, but he forgot to include you must not hold slaves or you must not rape? Instead, Spinoza argued that morality comes from the fact that you and me are equivalent. There's nothing about me that's special just because I'm me and you're not. As long as I am rational, I have to realize that your interests are just as important as mine. And if we all recognize that, we have a basis for morality, for treating others, for wanting for others what we want for ourselves. And Spinoza's quote indicates that that is the only logical position. If I say, I'm special because I'm Steve, you're not Steve, and to hell with you, well, I can say that, but it's not very logical, and you don't have to accept it. The second quote is hundreds of years later. It's from a book by a physicist who lives at Oxford, David Deutsch. His book is called The Beginning of Infinity. And Deutsch lays out an argument for a new enlightenment for the 21st century. That quote is that anything that is not ruled out by laws of nature, that is the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, is achievable given the right knowledge. Now that is whereas Spinoza's quote was about morality, Deutsch's quote is more practical. It's what we can achieve. And it is a call for us to try to change the world, obviously change the world according to Spinoza's dictum, namely to achieve for everyone else what I want for myself. But Deutsch gives us the confidence that solutions to problems exist. Even though problems are inevitable, problems are solvable, given the right knowledge. And that was an essential theme of the Enlightenment.
Chapter 1 begins with a question. What is enlightenment? Please elaborate more.
Well, that was the title of a famous essay by Immanuel Kant. I forgot to mention him as an Enlightenment philosopher, where it was his essay that really gave us the word enlightenment. He defined enlightenment as growing up, as setting aside our childish immaturity of getting our answers from authorities. A child wants to know something, asks his parents. He said that a society is childish if, when it wants to know something, it just looks for authorities, for scripture, for dogma, for conventional wisdom. Instead, his alternative was, and this is another motto, dare to understand. That is, try to use reason, logic, evidence to understand the world.
Please elaborate more about counter-enlightenment. What do you mean by that?
Yes, the Enlightenment never took over Western society. The idea that the Enlightenment is Western is wrong for two reasons. One of them is that some Enlightenment ideas were also raised by other civilizations, by Arab civilization and African and Indian, but also the West never wholeheartedly adopted Enlightenment ideas. Almost as soon as the Enlightenment began, there was a counter-Enlightenment. These were romantic ideas that we should not use reason and intelligence, but we should rely on emotion and intuition and gut feeling. It was the idea that there is no such thing as an individual. We are all part of a nation, a culture, that all of us are connected by blood, by kinship and ancestry, by soil, the land that we live on, and that the ultimate value is glory, the glory of the nation, or even the glory of brilliant heroes, of a Superman. There was also in the Counter-Enlightenment a romanticization of violence, of that war was good for people because it called forth heroism and sacrifice and altruism, whereas peace was, the Romantic movement often considered peace to be decadent and selfish and hedonistic and effeminate. The Counter-Enlightenment movements associated with people like Nietzsche, like Rousseau, like Herder, the existentialists, Schopenhauer, pushed back against the Enlightenment project. And one could say that some of the conflicts of the 20th century, like World War I and World War II, were counter-Enlightenment movements, that the glory of the nation or the empire or the race should be prominent, and if millions of human beings die, it's a price worth paying. Needless to say, my book is a defense of the Enlightenment against the counter-Enlightenment, and counter-Enlightenment forces are still very strong. You could say that in the United States, the movement led by Donald Trump is a counter-Enlightenment movement. Likewise, in Europe, the populist movements of Orban in Hungary, of Putin in Russia, of Erdogan in Turkey are very much counter-Enlightenment movements. They're sympathetic to religion, they're sympathetic to national glory, and they don't give a high role to the health and well-being of individual men, women, and children.
I believe that no matter the level of organization, small group, a school group, or a larger group, the first important thing is the individual, not the group. First, each of us should be in good health and having good results within that level of organization, group, school, or a society.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly, the individual is the entity that suffers, that feels pain, that feels pleasure. A nation is a lovely thing, but a nation itself doesn't feel pain. It's the people inside the nation that feel pain, or pleasure, or fulfillment. And of course, you can't experience any of these if you're dead, and so life is the most important value, and also health and education and prosperity. If you're starving, then you can't experience the benefits of life, and leisure, the opportunity to not work all the time, but to enjoy nature and culture and family and friends. All of these are what makes life worth living, and our highest moral purpose is to make those available to as many people as possible. So I argue with the Enlightenment philosophers.
On Chapter 4, Progressophobia, you wrote that intellectuals hate progress. Why? Is the idea of progress better than the progress itself?
Yes, that was a bit of a joke. I invented the term progressophobia. But I have found that many critics, intellectuals, people who write editorials for newspapers, my fellow professors, are very skeptical of the idea of progress. They think it was refuted 100 years ago that progress is impossible because World War I happened and World War II, and there's poverty and there's crime and there's terrorism, which are all true. But I argue that when you don't look at headlines, when you look at data, you see that even though there are still terrible events. There's still famines, there's still wars, but they're much, much lower. Now, most intellectuals don't look at data. They do not take math, they do not take statistics, they hate science, and so they can remember examples from recent history, from the newspapers, and I argue that that distorts their understanding of the world because news only reports what happens. It doesn't report what does not happen. And so if there's a country at peace, it's not a headline. If there's a country that is not having a famine, it's not in the news. You never see a journalist saying, I'm reporting live from a country that has not been attacked by terrorists or that is not at war. And so if you forget about all the places in the world that are improving, that are becoming more prosperous, that are becoming more peaceful, your understanding of the world will be wrong. And I argue that for many commentators, many intellectuals, many journalists have an incorrect understanding of the world because they pay too much attention to headlines and not enough attention to data. That's not the only reason that intellectuals hate progress. I think that all of us have what psychologists call a negativity bias. Our attention goes much more to what goes wrong than what goes right. This is well studied by psychologists, and it can lead us to value prophets of doom. Those who say the world is going to hell, there's going to be a disaster, we listen to them. Whereas someone who says, well, the data show the world is getting better, they're apt to be dismissed as some kind of unrealistic romantic. I argue that the facts are the other way around, and so there's a distortion in a lot of intellectual life.
Please explain what is the generating factor of the extending life expectancy in the past 100 years and why is so rapidly extending as time goes by?
Life expectancy at birth, that is, when a baby is born, how many years on average are they expected to live? Used to be about 30 years for most of human history. Today, it is 71 in the world as a whole, including all of humanity. And in Europe and the United States and East Asia, it's closer to 80 years. So what caused this increase? The main reason was advances in public health, the sanitation of drinking water, the separation of drinking water from sewage and waste and toilets. Also, medical advances like vaccination, so people don't die of smallpox and measles and yellow fever and other diseases. But also the development of antibiotics, of surgery, of blood transfusions, plus the increases in agricultural productivity. There are very few famines anymore. The only countries that have famines are either very, very remote or suffering from war. That was the result of scientific advances like crop rotation and other advances in farming, the invention of artificial fertilizers, the invention of vigorous hybrid crops in the Green Revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, where countries like Mexico and India and Bangladesh grew crops that were resistant to disease and that were much more productive. So all of those advances resulted in the huge increase in longevity worldwide.
Just 30 years ago, there had been a fear of spreading AIDS globally, but since then, nothing happened. What is the reason for that?
The two reasons that AIDS did not kill humanity were the spread of hygienic practices, safe sex, the use of condoms, and also the development of drugs, the antiretroviral cocktail of drugs that could treat AIDS when it broke out. There's still a rate of AIDS in Africa that is too high, and that maybe kind of the progress may be leveling off, but the worst years are behind us, and there almost certainly will be more progress to come.
Coming back to life expectancy, please elaborate as a hypothesis based on your graphs, what could be the life expectancy after 20 or more years in the future? Are we really going to live 100 or maybe 200 years?
I doubt it, even though I'm generally an optimist and I am a promoter of science and medicine and biotechnology. But I am skeptical of claims that we will either be immortal or even live to 125, 150. But I do think that life expectancy will lengthen. I think that a child born today will live much longer than you and me. Maybe on average 90, 95, 120, I personally doubt it, but longer than today.
There is a fashion on internet called reverse aging, and there are a lot of research and conferences. Can you elaborate?
I hope so, but the reason I'm skeptical is that there's a big division between the theory of what will reverse aging or halt aging, what will make us live forever, and reality. That when these
not quite forever, but
maybe not forever. Although there are some who, some theoreticians who say that we could turn off the aging process. That, of course, doesn't mean we'd lived forever, because we could still get hit by a bolt of lightning or get hit by a car, but that we wouldn't age. We wouldn't die of old age. The reason I'm skeptical is just looking at the result of clinical trials, of real drugs, of real programs, and 9 out of 10 times they are disappointing. Biomedical research is really, really hard. And even if something seems to work in theory, in a computer simulation, in mice, it very often doesn't work in people. Now, this is not a reason to be pessimistic, because lifespan has been gradually increasing, and I think it will continue to increase if we continue to invest in research. But I am skeptical that we will have a huge takeoff or anything like immortality. It's just not the way the actual experiments indicate.
I had read about experiments on mice, but not on humans yet. If we look on today's health issue, we have some positive and negative aspects. The positive ones are important discoveries which saved millions of people from dying by poisons, bacteria, viruses, but the negative ones are that most of aging people today are suffering from other diseases which makes them a long and unhappy life. Please explain this paradox.
Well, we actually are living better. I looked at that. The epidemiologists measure something called quality-adjusted life years. That is, not just how many years until you keel over dead, but how many of those years are you active? Are you free of pain? Do you have a sound mind? And that has been increasing too. Because if it were true that we, say, now live to 85 instead of 75, but those extra 10 years were in a wheelchair or with dementia, you could say that's not progress. That's not the reality. In fact, there are more years of healthy life as a result of these advances in medicine.
Yes.
There are also more years, necessarily, on average, there'll be more years of some people living with dementia or weakness, because at the end of life, there is always a decline. So if life is expanded, then there may be more years of dementia or disability, but there are many more years of healthy life at the same time.
Alzheimer is one of the problems.
And it might, yes, I don't think it's unrealistic to think that Alzheimer's disease will be treatable in 10 years. We don't know the answer, but it's not impossible.
Please explain the link between wealth and health. Are most of the very wealthy people also the most healthy? What would be the minimal wealth necessity in order to maintain long-term health?
Well, it is true that the wealthier the country, the healthier its people, although that correlation is weaker now than it used to be. It used to be that there was a very strong relationship. But because many public health measures are fairly cheap, like boiling water before you drink it, or breastfeeding a baby instead of feeding it formula with contaminated water, or holding a baby close to the mother's body so that it has body warmth and is less likely to die of cold. These are very, very cheap, but they can drastically increase human lives. And so the connection is still there, but it's weaker than it used to be because of knowledge. The great thing about knowledge is that it can be shared very cheaply, even free. Knowing how to prevent contaminated drinking water by boiling it, I could tell you that. It doesn't cost me anything, doesn't cost you anything. You now know it, you can apply it, you can live much longer, and no money was spent. That is happening increasingly in the developing world.
You wrote, and I quote, "Many people see inequality as a sign that modernity has failed to improve the human condition. And you consider this wrong. Can you explain it?"
Yes, I think we have to distinguish between poverty and inequality. Poverty is, of course, a vital, serious problem. But the poverty, what the quality of life is for poor people, is different from inequality, which is the gap between the rich and the poor. Now, they can be related, but they aren't necessarily related. And I argue that morally, the most important thing is to improve the lives of the poor, not to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, which may be extremely difficult in a global economy in which some people will distribute goods or services to the entire world, and they will naturally become wealthier. I think that it's a distraction to worry about that compared to are the benefits improving the lives of the poor. There's an old joke from the Soviet Union about two peasants who are absolutely poor, barely enough to eat. The only difference is that Igor has a goat and Boris does not. And in the joke, a fairy godmother comes and says to Boris, "I will give you one wish." And he says, "I wish that Igor's goat should die." Now, the humor in the joke is that they have become more equal, but neither one of them is better off. And so the moral is that we should concentrate on how well off people are, I argue, not the gap. Now, worldwide, that is, if you don't look within a country, but if you compare countries, inequality, in fact, is shrinking because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. And so global inequality, although it rose with the Industrial Revolution, as some countries got rich, leaving the others behind, from a state in which every country was poor, now it's starting to bend over because countries like India and China and Vietnam and Bangladesh are increasing in wealth and starting to narrow the gap.
Is progress sustainable? Please elaborate.
Well, the fear of progress is that it would come at the cost of planetary resources, of oil and metals and land. I think there is a severe problem with greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide that could bring on climate change. So I think that is the world's most serious problem. But many of the other problems, such as that the world would run out of oil or run out of land for agriculture, turn out to be misguided. For one thing, as technology changes, we can get more and more out of less and less. With advances in agriculture, we don't need as much land to grow enough food to feed the population. Also, when a resource starts to become scarce, say a strategic metal or petroleum, then its price rises, which means that there's an incentive to go after more and more inaccessible deposits, to get better technologies for extracting it, and to conserve the way it's used. Finally, human populations don't grow exponentially forever. That was a big fear of the 1960s and 1970s. We now know that as countries become wealthier, as citizens become better educated, as people move from the country to the city, and as women become more empowered, birth rates fall. And it is likely that the world will peak in population in the middle to the second half of the 21st century, and population will even start to come down. That has happened in most of Europe. It's happened in East Asia, such as Japan, and it will probably happen to the rest of the world. Now, again, this does not mean that we should not be concerned about climate change, and that is a fear that progress may not be sustainable. We have to concentrate on that problem, but the other parts of the fear that progress is not sustainable turn out to be false because of the spread of knowledge. We do more with less.
Please talk about the environmental movements, eco-pessimists, Greenpeace, and the prophecies of environmental doomsday.
Those were very popular predictions in the 60s and 70s, and many people, I think, still believe that there will be a crisis because of overpopulation. There'll be a crisis because of a shortage of petroleum, a shortage of metals. I think those predictions have been falsified. Again, I take seriously the problem of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. That remains a problem, but the classic doomsday scenarios of starvation and famines because of overpopulation and pollution turn out to be false. Likewise, the epidemic of cancer that was supposed to be caused by an increase in pollution turns out to be false. Now, one of the reasons that we have averted these catastrophes is that there have been controls on pollution. There have been environmental regulations, such as the Montreal Protocol that halted the expansion of the hole in the ozone layer by controlling the release of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, into the atmosphere. In the United States, and I think in other industrialized countries, even though the rate of population went up, the number of miles driven has gone up, economic growth has increased, but pollution has gone down because cars emit less pollution. There are controls on the release of pollution into the water supply. So environmental regulations and improvements in technology, which mean that our technology is less polluting than it was in the 1960s and 1970s, have helped to avert some of the catastrophes that were predicted. I argue in the book that there are really two different approaches to protecting the environment. The classic green movement, which came out of the Romantic movement, sees humans as evil spoilers of a pristine planet, blames the Industrial Revolution and economic growth for the destruction of the environment, and calls for a radical decline in population, maybe through government coercion, calls for a halt to economic growth, calls for deindustrialization, going back to a simpler lifestyle and greater harmony with nature. The other approach to the environment, which is called eco-modernism or eco-pragmatism, acknowledges that there have been environmental costs to the Industrial Revolution. They have brought, though, many benefits, such as a longer lifespan and more mobility, less poverty. But now we have to pay the costs, and we pay the costs by advances in technology that allow us to enjoy the same benefits, but with less harm to the environment. It's natural, as countries get richer, that they become more ecologically conscious, both because richer countries can afford pollution control technology. If you have no electricity at all, you're not going to care about pollution. If you're rich enough to have electricity, you can then take the next step and figure out how do we get electricity without the pollution. But also, interestingly, as countries get richer and better educated, their values rise, and they start to care about the environment more and apply technology, science, knowledge, policy to the task of reducing pollution while continuing to increase human well-being. And so I argue in the book that we need an eco-modernist or eco-pragmatist approach, which has paid off in the past. Many aspects of the environment are improving. We now have to apply it to the challenge of climate.
Obviously, you wrote a very long book, and I hope we can cover some topics like knowledge, for example. Could the world be getting not just more literate and knowledgeable, but actually smarter?
Yes, many people don't believe this. I have many graphs showing how we're getting richer, we're living longer, our countries are safer, there's less crime, there are fewer wars. But here's one other way in which we're getting better, and this is very hard to believe, which is we are getting smarter. Now, that seems incredible, but it's real. If you look at tests on IQ scores, intelligence tests, over time, you see that they go up in every country. Now, you don't see that in the scores themselves because they constantly readjust the scoring to keep the average at 100. But if they used a constant yardstick, then you see that the percentage of questions that people get right has increased. Now, how could this happen, you might say? We're not biologically, we're the same species. We haven't changed our brains or our genes. But as education becomes more widespread, as people spend more years in school, and as concepts from science and technology and mathematics kind of filter down from universities into everyday speech, then we have better cognitive tools, and we can think about things in terms of trade-offs and markets and win-win situations and evolution. We have all of these scientific concepts that now everyone knows, and that, in a sense, makes us smarter. There's a name for it. It's called the Flynn effect, after a philosopher, James Flynn, who discovered it.
Please explain the next paradox. As we have more knowledge coming from the scientific discoveries, we also have more pseudo-knowledge coming from the pseudoscience promoters, and this trend is very strong.
Yes, I don't think we really understand that paradox. On the one hand, science is advanced. We have sources like Wikipedia that make knowledge available. We have fact-checking in newspapers. At the same time, we have crazy conspiracy theories in the United States that Hillary Clinton ran a child prostitution ring out of a pizzeria, or that the planes in the sky are diffusing tranquilizer gases that pacify the entire population. Crazy stuff. What it shows us is that just spreading information is not enough to spread understanding and truth. There has to be a rigorous system of checks and balances, of fact-checking, of peer review, of criticism, of free speech, so that the bad ideas can be refuted by the better ideas, and institutions that earn people's trust, that have such a reputation for factual accuracy, that people will trust those institutions as opposed to any guy with an internet connection who spreads some conspiracy theory. And we have not yet solved the problem of how to make truth and rationality more widespread.
How about happiness itself? How can a scientist measure something as subjective as well-being?
The easiest way to measure how happy someone is to ask them, how happy are you? who could be more of an expert than the person themselves? Now, you might think, well, people lie and people don't know how happy they are, but these measurements have been calibrated, have been checked against other measures of happiness, and they seem to be a reliable measure. For example, if I say I'm happy, then you ask my wife, my friends, my coworkers, is Steve happy? They give a similar answer. If you look at the parts of the brain that are active in response to, say, a picture of a baby that makes people happy, that correlates with how happy people say they are. So it's a pretty good measure. And what you find when you ask millions of people how happy they are, or sometimes how good a life do you have, not exactly the same, but related, that the countries that are wealthier have people that are happier. Richer people within a country are happier. Countries that are freer, that have more democracy, less oppression, are happier. Countries that have more social trust, where you don't think your neighbor is constantly trying to cheat you, those countries are happier. So there are many things that make countries happier. And overall, the world's happiness has been increasing over time. Not everywhere. Some countries have been flat, and sometimes it can go down. But on average, happiness has been increasing.
But to me, it seems we are not very happy despite the progress. And depression is rising more and more. Can you elaborate?
It's actually, I looked at those statistics, and it's not clear that major depression is rising more and more. In the samples that look at the world, the rate of depression is pretty constant. We treat more depression now. More people who are depressed come in for treatment. So more cases are diagnosed. But there's no evidence that depression is increasing. However, one phenomenon that is very interesting is that if you ask people how happy they are, now you ask them, how happy is everyone else in your country? There is a huge gap. Most people say, I'm pretty happy. Everyone else in my country, they're really miserable. On average, there's about a 30-percentage point gap between how happy people say they are and how happy they say everyone else is.
Please talk about the most important existential threats and why we see so many movies and books presenting so many catastrophic events which did not happen. What are the real threats?
Well, I would list the two major threats as climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I don't think a nuclear war is likely, but it could be so catastrophic if it did occur, especially if there was an exchange with many, many weapons, which could release enough dust and smoke in the atmosphere to reduce solar energy and lead to crop failures.
And radiation.
And radiation. Radiation for the people especially in the area, but more catastrophic would be a so-called nuclear winter or nuclear autumn that would lower temperatures and lower solar energy so much that crops would fail. That could be a true catastrophe. Now, I don't think it's likely. However, it is so catastrophic that I think we should think about how to reduce that probability. There are other, as I mentioned, you and I have discussed climate change is another potential catastrophe. There are others, such as supervolcanoes, which could release so much dust and smoke and gas into the atmosphere that it could, in theory, cause a huge extinction. But the man-made threats are, I think, primarily nuclear war and climate change. There are others that would not be literally existential threats, but that could cause enormous suffering and misery, including pandemics, like, say, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. There's a possibility of massive cyber attacks that could wipe out our information infrastructure. Not existential, but still serious enough that we should make plans to prevent them.
Finally, how do you see the future of progress? The artificial will be merged with biological, the robots will replace human mind and work power. Are we any nearer of the technological singularity that Ray Kurzweil is predicting?
I don't think that robots will replace humans. I hope they'll replace a lot of unpleasant menial tasks, like making beds, like driving trucks, like picking crops. We then have the challenge of how to find work and to pay the people whose jobs have been made obsolete. But overall, this could be a huge benefit to humanity. And for reasons I explain in the book, I don't think that robots are going to replace humans, nor do I think that artificial intelligence is going to take over or subjugate humanity.
I thank you greatly for this amazing interview and the fascinating presentation of the ideas. I hope soon that a Romanian version of your book will be available for those of us which cannot read in English.
I think there may be a Romanian translation in the works.
Oh, that is good news.
After broadcasting the interview, a copy will be uploaded on my YouTube account and will be seen by all English-speaking people and Romanian people. I hope next time to record a subsequent new interview about how the mind works, if you agree.
Perhaps we will do that. Thank you.
Can we do it in 2019?
Let's discuss it then. Yes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
În pagina finală a cărții, Steven Pinker susține faptul că progresul este rezultatul inevitabil al creșterii raționalității. Citez: "Nu vom avea niciodată o lume perfectă și ar fi chiar periculos să încercăm să facem una. Dar nu există o limită a îmbunătățirilor pe care le putem obține dacă vom continua să aplicăm cunoașterea pentru a crește prosperitatea umană. Această poveste eroică nu este doar un mit. Miturile sunt povești, dar această poveste este adevărată, iar ea este adevărată în limitele capacității noastre de cunoaștere, iar aceasta este singura cunoaștere la care putem spera. O credem pentru că avem motive să o credem." Am încheiat citatul și mulțumesc din nou prietenului meu, Marius Burcea, pentru ajutorul acordat la traducerea și adaptarea întregului interviu și mă bucur să deschidem calea unei colaborări pe termen lung pentru a continua seria de interviuri cu profesorul Steven Pinker de la Universitatea Harvard. Fiți alături de noi data viitoare la o nouă întâlnire cu emisiunea dumneavoastră preferată, Știință și Cunoaștere.